Today, we are very lucky to have with us Mark Greenfield from the University at Buffalo. Mark currently serves as the university's Web Accessibility Officer, providing central oversight, technical expertise and guidance, leadership, and vision to support campus accessibility efforts. In addition to teaching graduate level courses on web accessibility, his research interests include inclusive design, emerging technologies, social media, the millennial generation and their use of technology, and the impact of globalization and technology on the academy. Mark is known for his thoughtful vision of the future of the web and technology on college campuses. Fortunately for us, he's also very active in higher education web communities. We will, by the way, take questions at the end, but please feel free to use chat for any questions, and I'll be monitoring that. And please join me in welcoming Mark Greenfield.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yep.
And we should be all set with that. Good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts about what accessibility might look like in the voice first era. This is something I have been thinking about for the past several years. I am called occasionally a futurist, where I'm always thinking about where technology may be taking us. And just to give you a little bit of background about me and technology, I first came across a computer in 1973 when I was still in high school and learned how to program Fortran. Back in the early to mid 70s, I was on the internet before it was called the internet, working for Digital Equipment Corporation in Colorado Springs in the early 80s. And it's really been interesting for me to watch how technology has evolved over time. And I'll be talking about this a little bit more about at the end, about just how quickly voice may become the primary way that we interact with digital technology. So I want to just clarify, especially for people in the accessibility world, when I'm talking about voice technology, I am talking about things like Siri and Alexa. I'm not talking about Dragon. I'm not talking about other text-to-speech tools that are typically used in accessibility, but I'm talking about the broader concept of digital assistants that rely on voice. So as I go through the presentation today, be thinking about Siri, be thinking about Alexa, and how we might be able to utilize that type of technology and how that's going to change our approach to accessibility. So I want to share with you some quick statistics. In 2021, about 90 million adults in the United States had a smart speaker installed. Now, that's not the only way that we interact using voice technology, but it's the one that most people relate to. What's interesting when you look at this graph where we had 32 and 42% increases from 2018 to 19 and 19 to 20, that slowed down a lot in 2021. And in digging into the reasons for that, it is primarily due to the pandemic and supply chain issues, where it is much more difficult now to get a speaker the next day kind of thing. So we think that's why that growth has slowed down a little bit, but it still is a very large number when you're thinking about the number of people who are using smart speakers and other technology. I first became interested in voice about 4 years ago and was given the opportunity to present at the Voice Summit in 2019. So that's 2.5 years ago now. They actually had a track at this conference for accessibility. It was a gathering of about 5,000 people from across the world who were the leading experts in voice. So I actually got to meet the person who named Alexa, Alexa. Interesting story why they named that. I don't have time to go into that today, but it was really an interesting conference. And I came away with a much better appreciation of where voice is going. And one of the things that I needed to get answered at this conference, and something that may be on your mind as well, is that when I'm thinking about voice and the idea of inclusion, what happens if somebody can't speak or hear? Isn't that a non-starter for folks who have that particular disability? And the way it is best explained to me, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is instead of thinking about voice first, it does not mean voice only. So think about multimodal, multi-surface interfaces that open up the possibility for true inclusive design. So if you're not familiar with the idea of multimodal, this is actually from the Wikipedia page on multimodal interaction. And it really is the interaction with virtual and physical environments through natural, with an emphasis on natural modes of communication. The advantage of multiple input modalities is increased usability. The weakness of one modality are offset by the strengths of another. And I think that's a really important point when we're thinking about, how to address accessibility issues. And I am a huge proponent of the relationship between usability and accessibility, and multimodal input really helps with that because it has huge implications for accessibility. A well-designed multimodal application can be used with people with a wide variety of impairments. For example, visual impaired users rely on the voice modality and some keypad input. Hearing impaired users rely on visual modality with some speech input. So it really opens up a lot of opportunity. So that's what we need by multimodal. And what we mean by multi-surface is there are so many different ways that we can interact using voice technology. So smartphones are probably still the most common way that people will interact with voice, but in the car is something that I've been using a voice assistant in my car for several years. And as you look at this graphic, thinking about smartwatches and headphones, home theater systems, even your appliances now, there's a way to multiple services or surfaces along with that kind of multimodal approach is how we can address issues with accessibility. So I really want to spend the majority of the presentation today going into how I think voice will change the approach we have to accessibility. And in my opinion, voice does have the potential to be the catalyst to move away from the outdated medical model of disability to the more inclusive social model of disability. And I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes going through both of these kind of models and why I think the social model is much more appropriate to what we try to do in higher education. So the medical model of disability is one that, at least for people my age, we are most familiar with, and kind of our paradigm when we think about people with disabilities. Disability is seen as a shortcoming that requires correction or accommodation. A disability is something where something is wrong if you have a disability. Disability is a problem of the person directly caused by disease, trauma, or other health conditions that therefore requires sustained medical care by professionals. Management of the disability is aimed at a cure. And again, the paradigm is that there's something wrong. And that's something that's a paradigm I think we all need to kind of move away from when we think about someone with a disability. There's often a stigma attached in the whole concept of separate but equal. And the way that our campus and almost all campuses approach providing services to our students who have disabilities is through a disability services office, or what we call at UB the accessibility resource office. And think about what a student has to go through to get help, to get an accommodation. They need to provide documentation to prove that they have a disability from an appropriate qualified professional. They have to outline what the accommodation needs to be and the rationale for it, and then identify the functional limitations that may impact their situation. That is not the best way, in my opinion, to think about someone with a disability and to provide services for someone with this disability. In fact, EDUCAUSE did a survey on this last year and found that nearly half of students with disabilities do not register with their institution's disability services office for support. In addition, 1 in 3 students with disabilities did not have a positive response to how their institution supports their need for accessible content and/or technology accommodations. So even though we have a wonderful accessibility resources office at UB, and I'm sure Arizona State is the same way, but this isn't necessarily the model we should be following if we really want to support as many people as possible and really think the right way around inclusion. So let's move on now to talking about the social model of disability. And I like to start this part of the presentation with the definition of disability from the World Health Organization. And their definition is that a disability is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of society in which they live. And that's a good way to start the conversation about what we mean by the social model of disability. And the social model talks about how society creates barriers that disable people by not taking into account the full range of human capabilities. The issue isn't a medical issue. The issue is really an inaccessible world. And what we need to do is focus on ways of removing barriers that restrict life choices for people with disabilities. When the barriers are removed, disabled people can be independent and equal in society, with choice and control over their own lives. So this chart kind of is a good summation of the differences between the medical model of disability and social model of disability. In the medical model, the impairment is the focus. There's often a stigma attached, and we're very reactive in terms of how we provide accommodations. And it usually is the responsibility, the sole responsibility of people in disability services to provide the accommodation that is needed. With a social model of disability, everything changes. It is focused on the environment, and it is really focused on inclusion and trying to include as many people as possible. And when you think about the social model of disability, there's opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive. And to me, the biggest change with all of this is it is now a shared responsibility where everybody on campus is responsible to make sure that everything that we do is accessible to all. I'm going to talk about just one book today. I usually mention several books, but I'm going to just mention one today. And that is the book called Mismatch by Kat Holmes. This is about a 150-page book. You can read it in one sitting. It really has lots of valuable information for any of the designers listening in today about how to really focus on inclusive design. And one of the charts in her book talks about how disability is not a personal health condition, but instead is mismatched human interactions. And again, that's a very important paradigm shift, which helps us focus on the social model of disability. And I want to talk about how voice can really enable that social model. So let me just take a quick drink here. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about how voice can address accessibility challenges. When I was preparing for that conference, the Voice Summit conference 2.5 years ago, lots of conversation on Twitter. And I asked a question, and then a few tweets later, I got this response that said, the premise of voice first is to liberate the user from the full attention, the cognitive load and mechanical load required by the screen first, keyboard first environment of the last computer age. So think about what happens when we take the keyboard and mouse out of the equation in terms of how we interact with a computer. And that's what voice can do. So all of the issues around using a screen reader or relying, when I'm testing websites for accessibility, the very first thing I do is see if that website works with a keyboard. 95% of them do not, and I can find that out in 5 minutes. So what happens if we take the keyboard out of the equation? And the potential for voice assistance is that we can remove the need for input text, the need to navigate a series of types and swipes or access the screen. They actually, voice technology offers a way for people to navigate phones, apps, tablets, computers, smart home technology, and all of the world around them with much fewer limitations. And as I go through this presentation, I'll be happy to share the presentation when I'm done. I do have some links in here for the sources of some of this information. So Kathy, just remind me to get you a copy of this slide deck when I'm done.
Will do.
So let's go into some specifics about how voice can address some of the accessibility challenges that we face on a college campus. The first is that we can reduce the need for additional separate assistive technologies. So we do a survey of our students every year, an IT survey, and it's been pretty consistent over the last 5 or 6 years that about 10% of our student population at the University of Buffalo uses assistive technology. That is a much bigger number than most people realize. We have 30,000 plus students on our campus. So if 10% of those students are using assistive technology, that's 3,000 students. The challenge, though, is that there are so many different kinds of technologies out there, and it can be difficult to make our websites and the websites that we buy and other digital technologies work with all of those various assistive technologies. So it would be great if we just baked in all of the need for accessibility right into the device that we are using. The second is that voice has the potential to drastically reduce the cost associated with assistive technology. I've been working with a student who is in our social work program, and she lives about 200 miles away. She's doing this online. And one of the pieces of software that the School of Social Work uses, it's from a third-party vendor, and it works really well with the latest version of JAWS. The problem with this student is that she does not have the latest version of JAWS, and it doesn't work for her at all. And anybody who has dealt with JAWS knows that it's very, very expensive. Or think about the cost of a Braille keyboard. Very, very good device, but also very, very expensive. So if we can eliminate the costs associated with, because of the need for assistive technology, I think that would go a long, long way. Third, we have the ability to drastically improve the experience for people with cognitive disabilities. You know, cognitive disabilities is something that over the last few years has become more and more of a focus for people who are familiar with the WCAG standards. One of the big changes between WCAG 2.0 and WCAG 2.1 was focused on cognitive disability issues. So think about somebody who has dyslexia and how much easier it might be to interact with voice and having information read back to you rather than having to, read that information yourself. This is an article from a voice website, the Voice Summit that I talked about before, about how voice assistants are helping people with dyslexia. So they're actually making great strides in that area, using voice technology. The next thing is that voice will provide support for us as we move away from thinking just about the web and thinking more holistically about digital. So I'm talking about artificial intelligence, talking about virtual and augmented mixed reality, talking about the Internet of Things. All of these are becoming reality very quickly. And I think that voice is going to be the natural interface for these advanced technologies. I think the user interface for artificial intelligence is going to be voice. The image I have on this slide, by the way, is an image of HAL. And if anybody remembers the movie, now I'm not remembering the name of it. Oh, Space Oddity, thank you. So back in 1970, when they were depicting what a computer might look like in the future with this computer named HAL, the interface to HAL was voice. And here we are 50 years later, but we are starting to get, the reality of voice is coming very quickly. So I want to share with you some of the innovations that are happening in the field of voice technology. And one of the biggest drawbacks of voice is working with people who have speech impairments, or even people who have dialect or have accents that make it hard right now for artificial intelligence to understand what's being spoken. So there's a really interesting project going on with Google right now called Euphonia. And they are looking really hard about how they can address some of these issues around speech impairments. There's a really good story on the Google Euphonia website about Tim Shaw. Tim Shaw played in the NFL for the Tennessee Titans, probably, I think he retired maybe 7 or 8 years ago. he was diagnosed with ALS. And on the website, and I have a link to it here, they go through a really detailed story about how they're working with him to develop voice technology for his particular speech pattern. So really interesting about where the technology is going and how quickly that it is advancing. Another company that is dealing with this is called VoiceIt. And this takes a step farther even than what Google is trying to do, really working with people who have difficulty speaking and coming up with the technology to understand what's being spoken, even if you have a speech impediment. So lots of good work being done that way. Another clever app which I've come across is one that allows Alexa to read sign language. So this is a web app that reads sign language through a camera, then says those words aloud to an Amazon Echo. When the Echo speaks in response, the app hears that and then types it out. So this is a good example of what I was talking about before with kind of multimodal, multi-surface. And it really, people would think that how could somebody who relies on ASL interact with speech technology, but they actually are developing apps to address some of those issues. Another thing that Google is working on is adding eye tracking controls to some of their products. So this provides a variety of devices and apps accessible to people with neuromuscular and other disorders. Instead of just a keyboard or voice control, the tiles are designed to be opened by touch or with the use of an eye tracking camera that determines where the user is looking. Again, another example of multimodal, multi-surface, which can address lots of issues which we couldn't even think about addressing with previous technology. Another interesting app for an Android is one that lets owners know if microphones are picking up the sound of a child crying, a dog barking, or a faucet running. This new sound notifications accessibility feature is designed to keep those who may be unable to hear those noises apprised of the situation around them. So really taking advantage of all of our senses and bringing, just making it much easier for people to operate in the digital environment. So here are some resources for you. The very first one listed there is the website that I go to most often. It's called voicebot.ai. It is run by a gentleman by the name of Brett Kinsella, whose Twitter handle I have below. Really good resource on statistics, and I'll show you in a second. They actually, on their blog, have a tag for accessibility, which is pretty active in terms of keeping up with the relationship of voice to accessibility. The Voice Summit that I mentioned before has a blog called the Voice Summit blog. And again, they also have a tag for accessibility articles. And then the Voice in Education website talks about how voice is being used in education. That is primarily focused on K through 12, but there are occasionally some higher education articles in there as well. That is run by a woman by the name of Julie Davis, whose Twitter handle I have listed below. Peter Erickson is the person who runs the Voice Summit. He is a very good follow on Twitter. And then Brian Rommel is really thinking about kind of the 30,000-foot view about where technology is going. And I'll talk about him a little bit more at the end of the presentation. Another good resource is the Voice Playbook from Google. So this is, I think it's a 45-page PDF file that you can download and really talks about how to be thinking about voice as you develop some of your technology tools going forward. It's not real technical. I think everybody would get benefit from reading through this presentation. And it really gets you thinking about the different types of voice interactions and how to design and what to think about as you're designing for those voice interactions. This is the VoiceBot blog that I mentioned before. I have the website URL listed below it. Again, a really good resource when you want to kind of keep up with what voice technology can do. A couple things going on with the W3C. So the W3C actually has let me just move this out of the way real quick, working on a web speech API. Again, not going to get into the technical pieces about how you make websites work with voice, but the W3C is actually trying to develop some APIs and specifications about how that should work. In addition to that, the Web Accessibility Initiative in the W3C is starting to focus more attention on voice technology and text-to-speech, and they have a section of their website talking about some of this technology as well. So it really is an interesting field, something that is growing pretty quickly. And I want to spend some time talking about how quickly things may change. So in my concluding thoughts here, I want to mention two laws, two technology laws. The first is Amara's law, and that says that we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And that certainly has been true over my career. I remember when cell phones first came out. I think I got my first cell phone like in 1991. And I thought it was great technology at the time. People were saying this is going to immediately change everything. But it took 10 to 15 years before we fully realized what a mobile device could actually do. So Amara's law comes into play a lot where we kind of don't really think about the long-term effect that technology may have. The second law is Moore's law. Gordon Moore was the CEO of Intel back in the 1960s, and he wrote an article talking about how transistor density on integrated circuits doubles every 2 years. And a lot of people have been thinking and talking about Moore's law for the last 50 years. And when you look at it, almost everything that has to do with computer technology does double every 18 months. I remember back in the mid 90s when a zip drive became available. I thought it was the greatest invention ever. A zip drive costs about $100, and on one single drive, one single disk, you could store 100 megabytes of information. And in the world of floppy disks, that was extraordinary and completely changed the way that we think about things. But think about where we are today, where you can go and buy a flash drive, a 16 gigabyte flash drive for $10. So Moore's law is still in effect. But the problem is that we as humans have trouble getting our arms around what we mean by exponential change. So what I want to do real quickly is share with you the story, the proverb of the person who invented the game of chess. So the inventor came up with this new game, chess, shared it with the emperor, and the emperor absolutely loved the game of chess, thought it was the greatest thing he's ever seen, and wanted to reward the inventor appropriately. So the emperor asked the inventor, what would you like as a reward? And the inventor said, all I want you to do is give me one grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, give me 2 grains on the second square, 4 grains on the third square, 8 on the fourth, 16 on the fifth, etc., until we have filled up that entire chessboard. The emperor, without really understanding what we mean by exponential change, agreed to that, only to find out that if you go through that process of doubling the amount of rice per square, by the time you have filled up that chessboard, you have a pile of rice that is taller than Mount Everest. That is what we mean by exponential change. So let me share another personal story with me at the University of Buffalo. I started working at UB in 1987. We wanted to buy a Cray 2 supercomputer. It was the biggest, baddest supercomputer on the planet at the time. But even UB, as a R1 research university with reasonable resources, could not afford to buy a Cray 2 supercomputer. The price was $16 million. So what we decided to do instead was rent time on a Cray for $10,000 an hour from a local research company. So that's where we were when I started in 1987. This is a slide I came across from Brian, who I mentioned before, where he talked about the entire NASA computer infrastructure of 1969 would cost $1 billion today. Yet that entire infrastructure of 1969 can now fit on a $5 Raspberry Pi Zero. So as you think about technology, especially as you think about artificial intelligence, keep in mind that this is going to change exponentially. What we're going to see, what we've seen over the past 5 years, it's not going to be 5 years before we see that double. It's going to probably be 5 months when that doubles again. So a lot of people criticize artificial intelligence in accessibility circles right now, and I completely understand that criticism. For example, with relying on artificial intelligence for video captioning, it's not 100% accurate. And when you're dealing with mathematical formulas and scientific notation, a lot of the most important information isn't properly recognized by artificial intelligence. So a lot of people in the world of accessibility and accessible technology are very down on artificial intelligence. What I like to tell people is that, yes, it is not perfect today, but it is going to improve very, very quickly. And I think everybody will be surprised 5 years from now about where we are with all of these technologies. So a book that has not been published yet, but should be published, I think, in the next year, is from Brian Rommel, talking about the last interface. And I'm really interested, there is a few things on his blog post about this, but I'm really interested to think about, will we have a world where we don't rely on the keyboard and the mouse and even on a screen as the primary way that we're going to interact with technology? Brian's premise is that it's going to be voice that we interact with the technology for lots of reasons. The final thing I want to mention before we get to some questions and answers is that I have been involved with making websites literally since day one. I made my first websites about 6 weeks after the web officially got launched, when I was working at UB at the time. And I've been involved with accessibility, with web accessibility, for about 25 years now. And as I come to the conclusion of my career, I'm actually retiring in January. And as I look back at what's happened in the accessibility space over that time, I'm very disappointed with the lack of progress that we have made when it comes to accessibility on the web. I am hopeful that with voice, we're going to get it right from the start. Here are some statistics for you from WebAIM. WebAIM, if you're not familiar with WebAIM, is a research group based out of Utah State. And for the past few years, they have been doing what they call the WebAIM Million. What this is they go out and crawl the top 1 million home pages with an accessibility crawler. Keep in mind that the accessibility crawler is only finding about 1/3 of errors. There is no technology right now that can completely find every accessibility issue. The latest statistics, which is from last year, from this year actually, from 2021, is that across the 1 million home pages, there were 51 million distinct accessibility errors detected, for an average of 51.4 errors per page. 98.1% of home pages had detectable failures. We have so much work we need to do when it comes to the web. Lots of reasons why this has happened over time. Progress has been very slow, but my hope is that when we talk about voice technology, we're going to get this correct right from the start. And I was very encouraged when I was at that voice summit, where every presentation that I went to talked about inclusive design. Everybody was talking about how you can utilize multi-surface, multimodal philosophy to address accessibility issues and really make everything work for everybody. And I'm seeing this even on the Google side of things, where The Alexa Accessibility Hub is where they're bringing together everything around accessibility within Alexa as a single point. It is really a point of emphasis for everybody I've talked to in the voice world to focus on inclusive design and hopefully address some of these issues. And I want to close with one final slide. And Tim Berners-Lee, who is the person who invented the web, and this quote gets used a lot, and I use it a lot. And he said right when he first created the web, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of a disability, is an essential aspect. And the illustration I have here is actually his model for how the semantic web could work. So for any developers who might be listening, if you really want to make your website more accessible and work with voice technology, focus on the semantic web and the meaning of the information as much as the information itself being provided. That is the single thing that we have not done a good job of as web developers over time, is really understanding the semantic web, and lots of work we can be doing on that. So with that, let me close with one final slide. And again, this is for the developers out there, and even the designers and even content folks who think that accessibility is an extra burden and takes too much time and too much effort. And I love this quote from Haben Girma, who is an accessibility advocate. She actually graduated from Harvard Law School, and she is legally deaf and blind, and really a remarkable story. I follow her on Twitter. The link I have here is to a talk she gave at the AHEAD conference, I believe in 2019. But one of the quotes from that talk was, she looks at disability as an opportunity for innovation. And I think that's the approach anybody involved with technology should take, is that there is opportunity for us to innovate in a way that makes everything that we create much more inclusive. So with that, that is the end of my formal presentation. I'm happy to open this up to questions and any comments people have. I'd be curious if you're doing anything at ASU around voice technology as well. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So, Mark, I'm seeing one question here. In my experience, voice as an interface is only efficient if one is alone, not useful in class, in the office, or in public places like the library, coffee shop, computer lab, etc. How do you see this being resolved?
So I think eventually that goes back to the idea of multimodal and multi-surface, where there are going to be situations, even privacy, where you might be in a situation where you want to order something using voice, but don't want your next door neighbor to hear that, whether you're in a restaurant or on a bus or whatever. So that's where the idea of multimodal will come in, and that in certain circumstances, there might be other ways for you to interact with your technology. But that is a concern. And I think, I don't know what's happening with library space at ASU, but at UB, at libraries, we're creating a much different library environment, where we're creating lots of very small private workplaces for people to get together and do things. So a very good question. And I think that the idea of multimodal will be the way that gets addressed.
Okay, here's another one. Chad Price says, I have heard him speak before. Have you seen anything about how the things you're talking about may be able to engage someone who is deaf-blind? You mentioned them separately.
Right. So I think, some deaf-blind is a really challenging circumstance for people to interact with technology, and Haben relies on a Braille keyboard, and she's very good at it. I think the technology will advance enough that, there's going to be other ways for her to interact. She can speak, so the question is, how would, again, the idea of multimodal and multi-surface, if she can talk to a device, how can she get that information back if she is deaf and blind? And is there a better way for that information to come back to her than relying on a tactile, Braille keyboard? This is where innovation, I think, will come into play, where there's probably things out there that nobody has really thought about in terms of how she might be able to interact with that. When I'm thinking about accessibility and the personas that, with accessibility. So as I'm designing things, going back to my web developer days, most people in the web world are familiar with personas. I always recommend that you include accessibility personas. So include somebody who is blind or who has limited vision or who is colorblind or who has a motor disability. The one I focus on the most, though, is a persona where somebody is deafblind, because that combination is probably the most difficult to really envision how they'll interact with a particular product. And a lot of this gets back to the ideas of inclusive design and keeping things simple. One of the things I've noticed over time is websites have gotten way more complex and have gotten away from understanding why somebody comes to the website in the first place. So for example, most web pages that I look at, again, I'm looking at this not just as working at UB, but in my consulting work, most web pages I come across have literally hundreds of navigation options. We've learned over time to hide those in drop-down menus or put those in a fat footer. But for somebody relying on assistive technology, they're gonna, the first time anyways, go through all of those links, most of which have absolutely nothing to do with the task at hand. So I think, and this is where I like thinking about how a voice interface would work, is thinking about what information is really needed on a page. Do you really need all that navigation? Look at your analytics data and you will find that 95% of the links that you provided on a page, nobody ever opened up. So you can simplify things. And even as we design for the mobile screen, we started to see that a little bit where, mobile designed websites or mobile first websites are much simpler to look at. I think we need to take it a step farther to make it much simpler. People come to a website to get information. They have a question they want answered, and anything else beyond that is just noise. And the more we can focus on designing for the task at hand, I think the more progress that we'll make.
If you'd like to just unmute and ask questions, you don't have to type them in the chat. Just unmute and ask away.
So there's a question here, a lot of excitement in virtual reality at ASU. What are some of the things we should consider as voice relates to VR or as to making VR accessible from the beginning? So I would go back, virtual reality is really an interesting space. And I would go back and really focus on that concept of multimodal, multi-surface, especially the multimodal. So if you're in a virtual reality environment and someone is blind or has low vision, how would they interact with that environment? Or are you relying on sound? How would somebody who can't hear be able to interact with that environment? So I think going back to really understanding the basics of inclusive design and designing your virtual reality or augmented reality environments to understand and be creative and innovative with how you can address some of those issues. By the way, our School of Social Work is using virtual reality in teaching for a couple of their classes. And I have not talked to them this semester, unfortunately, but I want to reach back because they were really trying to understand how accessibility would work in that environment.
If I can just mention with the virtual reality stuff at ASU, they have the team that's doing that has reached out to the Disability Services Office, and we've had staff go over and actually experience it and give feedback. We've had people with different disabilities that have been able to go and do the experience to provide the feedback, which I know that they've found to be very helpful, and looking at how they can make it more accessible for those who are going to be engaging in that environment.
Right. So was there any kind of main takeaways from that feedback?
Yeah, so a lot of the conversation had to do more with those who were deaf that couldn't engage auditorily, but they could. We talked about captioning that could be associated with the audio that was there. Also, we talked about having a virtual interpreter that could be potentially embedded into the virtual reality experience. We talked about, and I think Cedric experienced some of that. He could probably talk a little bit about what some of the feedback he gave from someone who was blind, talking about having additional description about what's going on in the environment.
Right.
So it's kind of like rather than just not just the auditory speaking, but also a descriptive element to what the environment looks like. And so that can be more of an inclusive experience for them, who can have like a third track with the audio description included in it, so that they can experience what actually is being displayed in that environment.
Right. So that audio description, which, we haven't done a good job even on the web in general, that would be great if we could somehow just make that part of the virtual reality environment, and even the captioning. So all of those are really interesting ideas. And you actually bring up a good point related to captioning in general, where it's not just about the words being spoken. There are lots of situations where you need to go well beyond just the words that are spoken when you're thinking about captioning your videos.
Yeah, great points.
It often seems to me that most ways of consuming of input and output comes down to text. So if you start with text, then the output can be voice, or it can be tactile, or it can be visual. If you just start with text, then the technology can come in and do anything they want with that text. But the text has to be there first. I don't know. What do you think about that, Mark?
So I think I would even take that as maybe approach that same answer a little bit differently. And that's where we're going back to what I meant about semantics and the semantic web. So semantics is really, the describing what the data is, what's actually there. And there is, evolving technology that makes the semantic web even more powerful than it is today. But getting back to your point, kind of going back to the basics of how a computer works, thinking about input and thinking about output. When I first started working with computers back in the mid 1970s, the input was a punch card. That was your only option. The output was a piece of paper, a printout. But if we think multimodal, which is giving as many options based on a person's abilities and the environment that they're in for both input and for output, ultimately, I think that's where we want to get, where we have that flexibility, where you can, you still may want to type on a computer. I actually have a degenerative disc in my neck, which makes it difficult for me to type for long periods of time. So I use Dragon Naturally Speaking. And so I'm talking to my computer more than I'm typing to my computer. I wish I would have learned about this 15 years ago, because I can talk way faster than I can type. And I'm a terrible speller. But I'm using Dragon Naturally Speaking, all of those issues go away. So again, I think ultimately, that's why I always emphasize the whole multimodal, multi-screen concept, because give as many options for input and then as many options for output and combinations of those. And I think ultimately that's how we get to inclusive design.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I've noticed, I just started playing around with iPhone's voice control, or voice access. It's voice control on Android, right? Voice access, I think is what it's called on the iOS.
Not sure.
But it's so much fun. It's like Siri on steroids.
Right.
And I just see, although it's listed under the accessibility options on the iPhone, I see it being talked about in more mainstream vehicles like Business Week had an article on it.
Right.
And I think there's something that I'm starting to feel about it, some of the accessibility options that we offer. If we can get them to be mainstreamed,
Right.
then you suddenly see the funding coming in. You see, okay, Google's working on it. They have the resources to really advance that technology. But if it's something like a Braille keyboard that not very many people use, you don't see that technology moving very fast.
Right.
So once you mainstream something, and I think that you have a better chance of that technology being advanced.
Right. So when I was at that voice conference, I spoke with somebody from Google about this very idea, about why bury, for lack of a better word, why bury the accessibility features under accessibility when they actually benefit lots of people. Almost everybody I know, when they discover what's in that accessibility area, whether you're on an iPhone or an Android, are like, this stuff is really good. So they were, at the time, were struggling with, just it's almost like a user interface issue and an information architecture issue. Should they put it in an accessibility section because that's where people with a disability will go to look for it? Or if they put it into the general kind of settings and features, that might not be a logical place for somebody with a disability to find what's available. My response back to that was, go back to your information architecture and look at faceted design and put it somehow in both places. Have everything to do with accessibility under the accessibility hood, but then still make it available in your general places for everybody else. But think about what a smartphone is. That really is, to me, the first example of a multimodal device, because you can type on it, you can tap on it, you can talk to it, you can listen to it. So it really has kind of that baked in functionality. And I just think, I'm still trying to figure out how to make my Apple Watch. I'm not comfortable talking to my Apple Watch yet, but I can. So I just, excuse me. I think the more we just, really think outside the box about how these devices can work together, lots of opportunity to take advantage of the technology.
Yeah, I really agree. Does anyone have any more questions? Anyone speak up? Okay, well, this has been absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I don't know what the weather's like there. Do you have a lot of snow?
Actually, we have no snow. We are warm today at 45 degrees, so we will take that. I'm going to have a warm week. It's going to get up to 60 on Thursday, which doesn't happen very often in December, so we'll take it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool down here too. So well, thank you so much, Mark.
Yep, thanks for having me. Yep, and if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out. Kathy, I'll get you a copy of the slides if you want to share those.
Yeah, would you? And then I'll put that on the, again, that'll be on the accessibility.asu.edu/UDAT for UDAT group. And it'll be on that page. So please join us at our next meeting in January also. So thank you, everyone.
All right, have a good day, everyone.
It was a delight.